Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. So today I have part 2 of my favorite and least favorite shades from each of my eyeshadow palettes. I posted part 1 a little less than a week ago, so definitely go check that out for the first about third of my collection. So I am moving on to part 2, so I have the second, third, probably a little less than a third of my collection in this video, and I am so excited to talk about these palettes. I think this is just a fun way to look back through my palettes, talk about what I like, what I don't like. It is definitely dependent on each specific palette. There are some overall themes within these shades, but for the most part it is personal preference on each palette. So if that interests you, definitely stay tuned. But before we get into the video, if you would consider subscribing, I would really appreciate it. I post a lot of eyeshadow related videos talking about my palettes, tutorials, and different panning projects. So definitely subscribe if any of that interests you, and we can jump right in. So I am going by brand, so I'm going to start with BH Cosmetics for this video, and this first one up is the Miss Claus So Spoiled palette, and this was a holiday release for them a few years ago. I think this palette is so cute. I really like the color story, but I would say my least favorite shade would be Glitter Me. I mentioned this in the previous video, but yellow gold shades are not a favorite of mine. They are usually towards the bottom, if not the bottom shade in each of my palettes, if they're in a palette. So it's just not a shade that I'm really drawn to the color of. I don't really like how it looks. And yeah, just completely personal preference, but a lot of palettes do have yellow gold shades like this, so it's a little hard to get away from, but there are so many beautiful shades in this palette, and I would say my favorite would probably be Unwrapped here. I think this one is just so pretty. It's a nice light pink. I am definitely more of a fan of lighter shimmers as compared to darker shimmers, and that one is just so pretty, and I really like the formula of that one. Some of the shimmers in here are a little bit flakier, not as opaque, so I really enjoy when they do perform well, and I feel like Unwrapped really is so pretty. Alright, next for BH Cosmetics is my Nuvo Neutrals palette. So this is a nice neutrals palette, and I really do enjoy this. This is one of the older palettes within my collection, but I do still enjoy it, and I do still like to use it. My least favorite shade would be this darker antique gold over here. Similar things to say as the previous palette. This is just not a color I am drawn to. I just don't like it very much. I don't really know what it is about the color, but it is just definitely a least favorite of mine. In terms of my favorite shade, I feel like this is kind of difficult. I think I might go with this shade up here. Again, in my previous video, I mentioned I love a good mauve-y toned matte shade, and I think that one is really pretty. There are definitely quite a few shades in here that I do really enjoy, so this was a little bit difficult, but at the end of the day, I love a mauve tone purple matte shade, and that one is really nice. Next up we have my Nabla Dreamy palette, and my least favorite shade from here is the shade Delirium. This is just a shade that I don't really like the performance of. I mentioned earlier that I'm not a huge fan of darker colored mattes, and this is definitely one of those, but the actual performance and formula of it also isn't great. It's just a little bit on the chunkier side, and I feel like it's really flaky and doesn't pack down as evenly as I would like it to. I feel like that swatch didn't look too bad, but I am just really not a big fan of this shade. I feel like the performance of it just is not great, especially compared to the other shimmers in this palette. I feel like the rest of these shimmers and my general experience with Nabla shimmers is they're very nice and smooth and pigmented, but that one is just not, in my opinion. My favorite shade would probably be the one next to it. I think this is just such a pretty peachy shimmer shade. I feel like I showed a few peachy shimmers in my previous video as my favorite, and I will continue that into this video. I think that one is just super pretty. This is not a palette that I reach for a ton, but I do like a handful of the shades in here, and that one is definitely one of them. Next we have my Nabla Secret palette. This is my current Project Level Up palette, and I am so excited to be working on it. I think this palette is really pretty, a lot of beautiful shades in here. In terms of my least favorite, I would go with Creation Crown. Again, similar things. It's a little more on that antique gold side, just not a favorite color of mine. I'm not going to repeat myself too much with this shade, but it is my least favorite within this palette. There are a couple I'm thinking about for my favorite shade. I'm between like I Promise, Rosemary, even Contigo right here is super pretty. I think I might choose Rosemary for my overall favorite shade. I just love that green color to it. I'm a big fan of green eyeshadow, and that one is super pretty, and it just adds a really fun pop to this palette. I love this little middle section here to complement the neutral shades. So that is probably at the moment what I would say my favorite shade is from this palette. Next up we have my Poison Garden palette from Nabla. And my least favorite shade from here would be Craving. Just another darker purple shimmer. This is another color that I'm just not the biggest fan of personally. I do think the performance of this one is actually pretty good, but I'm just not a big fan of the color of this one. For my favorite shade, again, I feel like I have a few, but I think I might have to go with Berry Bite right now. This one just always catches my eye. I think it's so pretty, and I do love a good colorful matte moment, and I feel like that one is super pretty, and it works really well with a lot of the other shades in this palette as well. It adds a nice little pop to some of the more neutral shades. So that one would probably be my favorite from this palette. Alright, next up we have my Delancey Panda palette. This one is super cute. I got this one because I was feeling like I was missing some gray tones in my collection. So this is not a palette I use a ton, but it definitely has a time and a place. My least favorite shade would be Coal right here. This one is just a sequin black shade. I chose this one because there is a pure matte black next to it, which I would definitely prefer to use over a sequin matte, and I just don't really see the need to have both of these in this palette. So I would definitely go with Coal as my least favorite. It's going to be probably my least used in this palette. In terms of my favorite, I would probably go with Cigarette, just a nice light silver shimmer shade, but I also really enjoy Silver over here in terms of the matte shades. So this one is, like I said, not a very used palette of mine, but it does have a time and a place, and I do really like the tone of these gray shades. Alright, moving on to my Ulta Harry Potter collection. This is the Gryffindor palette, and my least favorite shade from here would probably be Chocolate Frog. There's nothing wrong with that shade, I just like the other ones a little bit more. I have a lot of browns in my collection, and this one just fell on the lower end with the other shades in here. The other shades I tend to use a little bit more. I like reaching for the kind of warmer tone berry tones, and the brown was just a little more, I guess, boring in my opinion for this palette, but it's still a good shade. It still performs nicely, and I still do use it. It's just a little lower because of the other shades. For my favorite shade, that would be Mandrake. I absolutely love this color. It's such a beautiful pink tone shade, a little bit on the cooler toned mauve-y pink side. And I just think that one's really pretty. I use it in pretty much every single look that I create with this palette. And yeah, that one's just easily my favorite. I had no doubts about that in my mind. Alright, next up we have the Hufflepuff palette. So my least favorite shade from here would be Rust. Just that darker purple shade again, the shimmer. I really like darker purple matte shades like the shade Earth. I think is really pretty, but there's just something about those darker purple shimmers that are that specific tone that are just not my favorite. For my favorite shade, I would go with Galleon. This is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, yellow shades in my entire collection, matte yellow shades. I have mentioned this before. I don't remember if it was the previous video or earlier this video, but I love yellow eyeshadow. And I just really love the tone of that one. I think it's so pretty, and I am just so drawn to that shade. The color story in this palette seems a little confusing, not super cohesive, but I definitely tend to stick to the lighter, more neutral shades, kind of these ones up here, and I love using that Galleon shade in looks for this palette. Alright, next up we have my Ravenclaw palette from Ulta. So I really love this one. This one has such a beautiful color story. I love the neutrals with the pops of blue. For my least favorite shade, I am between two that I would consider my least favorite. One of them would be Fang, and the other would be Pixie. I feel like Pixie is kind of my least favorite shade in this palette just because it's out of my comfort zone a little bit. It is a bit of a brighter blue shade, and that just intimidates me a little bit. I really do love blue. Blue is my favorite color, just not specifically for eyeshadow. If I'm reaching for blue eyeshadows, I love lighter blues like this one up here or darker ones like this one. But having those kind of brighter blues just is not my absolute favorite, and it's mostly just because it's a little outside of my comfort zone. In terms of my favorite shade, I'm also between a couple. I love this Twilight shade down here. I think it is a beautiful navy blue, and I think that one is so pretty, but I also really love the shade Ghost right here. I just think this is a beautiful kind of gunmetal silver shade, and I don't reach for it a ton in this palette. As you can see, it's not the most used shade in here. I definitely reach into the blue shades more, but I just absolutely think that shade is so stunning, and it makes me want to reach for it every time I kind of look at it and swatch it out. So it's definitely going to be a goal of mine to reach into that more, but I just really love the color of that shade. Next up we have the Slytherin palette. So this one is also a little bit outside of my comfort zone, and that is just because it's a little bit more on the darker, grungy side. For my least favorite shade, I would probably go with Baron. That one is just, again, a darker shimmer shade, not an absolute favorite of mine, but honestly, there's not really a shade in here that I truly dislike. It's just kind of personal preference, not my absolute favorite. For my favorite shade, though, I would probably go with Ivy. I'm between Ivy and Moon, but Ivy is just a beautiful lighter green shimmer shade, and as I mentioned earlier, I love green eyeshadow, and I think the tone of that one is super pretty. I love that it's a little bit on the lighter side, but you can still tell it is truly a green shade. I just think that one is super pretty, and I enjoy playing with the greens in here, but it's just not what I'm reaching for all the time. Alright, next up we have Kylove. So this is a brand that is no longer around, but I do still have a couple palettes from them. So this first one is the Triumph of Venus. So my least favorite shade from this palette is this reddish matte shade over here. In another palette, it might not be my least favorite, but when I'm reaching into this palette, I am reaching for the cooler tones, the blues, and having such a warm pop in here just kind of throws me off a little bit, and I just find myself not wanting to reach for that one a ton. I don't feel as strongly about the 1740 shade, the matte yellow, but I think that's because it kind of has beam to offset it. But with this one, I just feel like it's kind of out of place. I like that it has variety within this palette. It's not just monochromatic blue, but that shade just isn't my favorite in this palette. It just feels a little bit out of place, and I kind of struggle incorporating that one into looks with the other shades in here. For my favorite shade, it is between a few of the blue shades. I really love the shade Seafoam, and I really love the shade Temptuous. I think if I had to choose right now, I might go with Temptuous up here. This is just a really pretty matte blue shade. I really like the tone of it. As you can see, I did hit pan in this shade. This was in my project Level Up earlier this year, and I really enjoyed working on it. I think Seafoam is really pretty as well, just that nice light icy blue shade. So it's easily between those two, but I think right now if I had to choose one, I would go the darker matte blue. Alright, next up we have my Kai Love Rococo palette, and easy least favorite shade would be Apotheosis here. Again, yellow gold shades, not a fave. For my favorite shade, there are a few in this palette that I really, really love. I'm going to give a special mention to these matte orange shades. I've mentioned in the past that matte oranges are not my favorite color of eyeshadow, but I really love the tone of these two. I feel like they're not that pure, warm toned orange shade. I really enjoy how these ones perform, the color of them. So I did want to give those ones a quick shout out, but if I had to choose an absolute favorite, I would probably go Royal down here. This one is just so pretty. It's kind of a periwinkle purpley blue shade, and I just really love how that one looks. It's not a very used shade for me in this palette, but it's so pretty and I just love the color of it. Alright, next up we have Be Bella Cosmetics, and this palette is their Daisy Days palette. So an easy least favorite shade would be the Pressed Glitter. I'm not a huge fan of Pressed Glitter in eyeshadow palettes, but kind of excluding that one from this, I would go with Roots for my least favorite. I just don't really like how that gray tone looks on my eyes. I feel like it just kind of washes me out. It doesn't look very good. So that one is easily one of my least favorite in this palette. For my favorite shade, I would go with Golden Glow here. This is just a really pretty kind of light minty green matte shade. I fell in love with that shade. I love that this is a neutral palette, but you do have some fun pops in here as well, and I have found Golden Glow to be a really fun shade to incorporate with neutral looks. It's not super in your face, not super bright or colorful, so it just adds that subtle little pop that kind of elevates the pure neutral looks, and I really enjoy that. Next up we have the Lotus Love palette from Be Bella. So my least favorite shade in here would probably be Supreme Lotus. It's between these brighter hot pink shades, and that is purely because they are out of my comfort zone, and I'm just not going to be someone who reaches for hot pink, bright pink shades on a daily basis. It's just not a color I'm going to be reaching for, but they are pretty, they are fun to play around with, but compared to the rest of the shades in this palette, they would be my least favorite. In terms of my favorite shade, I would probably go with Luck right here. This is just a really pretty kind of neutral purple shade. I had a palette, it was the oldest palette in my collection from Wet n Wild. It was called the Au Naturel palette. I have since decluttered that palette out of my collection, but it had this purple shimmer shade that was my absolute favorite shade in my entire collection, and this one gives me the same vibes. It's not an exact dupe, but it's just kind of that more neutral purple shimmer shade. I just think it's absolutely gorgeous. I love how it looks. Just a nice cool tone shimmer. It still has a little bit of color to it, but it is on the more neutral side, the more wearable side for me, so I really enjoy that shade. Alright, next up we have Oh Poppy from Be Bella. So this is a nice warm toned palette. So again, my least favorite would probably be the pressed glitter, but if we are excluding pressed glitters from this, I would probably go for the shade next to it as my least favorite, the shade Springfield. This is just a darker warm tone shimmer shade, not a favorite. I feel like I kind of repeat things with these least favorite shades because there does seem to be a theme with these, but it's just not a favorite color of mine. For my favorite shade, I would probably choose Flower Child right here. This is just a really pretty light orange shimmer, and I just really enjoy how those ones look. I am definitely someone who prefers lighter shimmers. I've mentioned this before, and I just think that one is super pretty. Alright, next up we have the Be Bella Sweet Sunflower palette, and my least favorite shade from here, as you can probably guess, is the shade Marigold, just that yellow gold shade. You Are My Sunshine is also a yellow gold, but I like it just a slight bit more than Marigold. But I am a little upset that this palette has two yellow gold shades that look very similar. I do wish there was a different color instead of one of those at least, but it does kind of fit the theme of this palette with the yellows and the browns in here, so I can kind of look past it. I get why they did it. For my favorite shade, I would go with Rustic, the shade with a nice big pan in here. Again, I mentioned earlier, I love yellow eyeshadow, and I just really love the tone of that one. I was super surprised when I hit pan on that shade. It was, I think, even less than 10 uses, and it kind of came out of nowhere in my opinion, but I am happy that that shade does have some good love and progress on it. I just really enjoy what that one looks like. I really love the mattes in this palette, and that one is easily my favorite. Next up we have my Rude Cosmetics Roaring 20s Carefree palette. I have an affiliate link with Rude Cosmetics if you are interested in checking anything out from them. It is always linked in my description box, and you can use the code JJBeauty for 15% off. Rude Cosmetics has some of my favorite products. I have their entire Roaring 20s eyeshadow palette collection, and I'm really hoping they're going to come out with more in the future because I just absolutely love them. And as part of their Roaring 20s collection, they have come out with blushes and lip products, which I haven't picked up yet, but they are definitely on my list, and I just really enjoy Rude Cosmetics. So for this palette specifically, for my least favorite shade, I'm kind of having a little bit of a tough time choosing. I think I know which one I would probably choose if I had to, but looking at this palette, there aren't really shades in here that I dislike. I would probably choose Livewire just based on the color of it. As I've mentioned, darker tone shimmers are not my favorite, but that one I really don't mind. So it's kind of difficult for me, honestly, to choose a shade from this palette as my least favorite, but if I had to, I would probably go with that one. For my favorite, again, this is a little tricky, but slightly easier. I think I would go with Swell right here. Just a really pretty, shimmery purple shade. A little bit on the lighter neutral side, and as I just mentioned with the Lotus Love palette, I really enjoy that type of shimmer shade, that type of color. So that one would probably be my favorite from this palette. Alright, next up we have the Roaring 20s Reckless palette from Rude Cosmetics, and my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Buzz. It is just a really bright looking neon orange in the pan. I feel like it does show up a little bit more muted, kind of yellow toned on the eyes, especially just on its own. So it's not as bright and in your face as it looks in the pan, but it's still just not an absolute favorite of mine from this palette. I like the other shades more. For my favorite shade, there are some really beautiful shades in here, but the one that I have considered my favorite since I got this palette has been Moonshine up here. I feel like I don't really use this one a ton, but it is super pretty. It's a beautiful duochrome shade. It kind of has a little bit of a more neutral base to it with a greenish shift, and I just think it's really pretty. And it is one that I do need to reach for more. Like I said, I don't reach for it a ton, but I think it's so pretty, and it was kind of one of my first introductions to duochrome shades, so I think it's really pretty. Alright, next we have the Roaring Twenties Neons palette. So again, there are beautiful shades in this palette. I think it is so fun. It's so bright and colorful. For my least favorite, I would probably say Power Surge. I'm between that one and Classic, but I feel like I'm more likely to use the matte shade over the hot pink shimmer. And again, it's just out of my comfort zone, personal preference there. My favorite shade is going to be so hard to choose. There are a few in here that are speaking to me right now. I love all three of these shades right here. I don't know what one would be my favorite. I think I might be leaning towards Sequins right here. I just really love the color of this. Compared to the other shades in this palette, I feel like that one's more on the wearable side, with it being just a nice orange shimmer shade. It's not super bright, not super in your face, not super colorful. So I do really love that shade, but there are so many in here that I think are absolutely stunning, and I really love this palette. Alright, next up we have my Roaring Twenties Excessive palette. So this is another just super nice neutral palette, and my least favorite shade from here would easily be Schnozzle. I just really don't like the look of those shades. I don't really know the point of them, I guess. I feel like it doesn't do much of anything. I feel like it's supposed to add a kind of glossy, shimmery look, but I just don't get it, quite honestly, and I could have easily done without that shade. But there are so many other beautiful shades in this palette that I kind of just ignore that one. For my favorite, oh, there are so many. I'm between Main Drag, Looker, Yap, honestly Keen. They're all so pretty. I feel like my kind of comfort shade within this palette would probably be Looker here, just that nice mauve-y toned pinkish matte shade. I just find myself gravitating towards that sort of shade so much, and I think it's so pretty, but the other shades in here are so pretty as well. I really like this palette. I really love kind of these first two rows or columns right here. I think they're so pretty. There are a lot of good shades in this palette is the basic message behind this. Alright, the last Roaring Twenties palette I have is the Indulgence palette, and this is the warmer toned neutral palette. My least favorite shade from here would probably be Jazzberry. Again, just that darker purpley toned shimmer shade. Not a favorite, but it is still kind of nice. I have used it a few times, but compared to the other shades in here, that one would probably be my least favorite. For my favorite shade, I'm going to mention two, but I do think one of them ranks slightly above the other. So in second place, I guess, would probably be Opulence. This shade is just so pretty. I feel like that swatch didn't even do it justice, but I feel like it's so sparkly and pretty. I just really love that one, but I think the shade that I like just a slight bit more is Manhattan. This one is a little bit of a duochrome shade over here. It's kind of a champagne gold with some hints of green and a little bit of more neutral in there. I just think it's so pretty, and I really enjoy using that one as an all-over lid shade. I really like this palette. It's a nice neutral option, but it has some more fun pops in here as well that kind of elevates this to a more exciting neutral palette. Alright, I have a couple more palettes to talk about for today's video. So next up is my Hot Topic Winnie the Pooh Halloween palette. This one is not available anymore, unfortunately, but I really love this one. I think it performs so nicely. Honestly, a lot better than I expected it to, with it being a Hot Topic palette, but I just really enjoy this one, especially for the fall Halloween season. I just think it's so cute. So my least favorite shade from here would be Honeybee, again a yellow gold shade. This one is a little bit on the brighter side, but it's still just not a favorite of mine. My favorite shade would probably be Tigger. I just think this shade is so pretty and fun. That swatch was not very good. I feel like it doesn't swatch very well, but it does perform really nicely on the eyes. It's just a nice kind of yellow toned matte shade, and I really enjoy that one. It's one of my most used within this palette, and I really enjoy it. There are a couple other shades in here I really love as well, like Piglet, and Halloween is such a beautiful green shimmer shade. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, but I just find myself using Tigger over and over again, and I really love that shade. Alright, then the last palette up is my Glitter Realm A Whole New World palette, and this is one of my favorite palettes in my entire collection. From the moment I got this palette, I did not want to put it down. I think out of all of my palettes, this is the one that I have created the most looks with for my Instagram or YouTube. I am just so inspired by this palette. I think it's so pretty. It has gone down in uses a little bit since I first got it, but it's still one that I absolutely love. Probably top 5 within my collection, so this is just such a good palette. For my least favorite shade, you guys might be a little surprised, but probably not too much. I would probably go with Cosmic. I thought about Forbidden Treasure, but I don't really mind that one as much, and I feel like Cosmic is a little bit more outside of my comfort zone just with that hot pink shade. I've mentioned a few hot pinks within this video as least favorites, and this one, I have similar things to say. It's just out of my comfort zone. I don't reach for it a ton. I feel like the formula of that one also is a little bit on the drier side, which isn't my absolute favorite, but I like the other shades more in this palette. There are so many good shades in here for my favorite, but I'm going to do a couple honorable mentions and then get into the one that I know is my top favorite. So honorable mentions would be Riff Raff and Raja. I really love those two. I think they're so pretty. I always get inspired to reach for those shades, but if we're going for absolute favorite, there is nothing that can compete with the shade Enchantment over here. This one is gorgeous. I hope it's picking up on camera just how beautiful this color is. I am obsessed with that one. I just really love the color of it. It's not the most wearable purple shade. If I'm being honest, it's a little bit on the brighter side, but it's stunning. I love the color of it, and I could just rave about this forever, but I really love it. I love this entire palette. It is so good. So that will conclude today's video. Let me know what you guys thought. I will have one more part to this video coming out, so definitely stay tuned and subscribe for that. Give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy. Let me know what else you would like to see from me, And with all of that said, I will see you in my next video. Bye!